Winter is a rough season for many bird watchers, but if you have the right approach, winter can actually be an incredibly rewarding time to learn about your local birds. There's actually some real advantages to watching birds in winter that don't occur in other seasons, like the fact that food sources are much more concentrated during the winter time, and so birds tend to gather in more concentrated groups. So in this video, we're going to talk about bird watching tips for winter, and I'm going to share 5 of my best tips for improving your experience with bird watching in winter. So the first tip is to focus on learning fewer birds, but to focus on learning those birds more deeply. A lot of people, when they do bird watching, they focus on identification and identification of as many different species as they can find. But for me, a lot of the real joy of bird watching comes from just finding one species and really spending a lot of time watching it so you can get to know it more deeply. Winter is a really great time to do this because there aren't as many other birds to distract you from getting to know the ones that are really common in your area. A lot of people think that because birds migrate and they go south during winter, that there just aren't really very many birds during the winter time. And while there's certainly less diversity during winter in northern areas, the birds that do stick around, they're quite active. They have to be eating and they have to be taking care of themselves in order to survive through the winter. So if you can tune into that, there really is a lot of bird watching that you can do during the winter time, but you're going to get less diversity of birds. And so the idea is to focus more on getting to know individual birds. This is where something like having a good field guide can really come in handy, and my guide has these color-coded range maps. In my case, it's a pink color for the summer range, a blue color for the winter range, and a purple for where they are year-round. A lot of the common ones in northern areas during winters would be things like chickadees, juncos, nuthatches, jays, crows, kinglets, and we'll talk more in tip number 3 about how to actually go about learning those birds in much greater depth than simply knowing how to identify them. The next thing is to use a bird feeder. Bird feeders are really great in winter because you can set it up near a comfortable window where you can have like a little bird watching station with binoculars and a field guide and a comfortable place for you to sit and look out at the birds. And bird feeders are really safe for birds during winter because when everything is cold, there's a lot less risk of diseases being transferred, and really in a lot of places you really shouldn't have your bird feeder up in spring and summer because it spreads diseases and the birds really don't need that extra food source during spring and summer. There's so much food around that it's really probably better for them to be out foraging on their own. But the really cool thing in wintertime is that because there are less options for birds to get food, if you do set up a bird feeder, you're basically guaranteed that lots of birds will come in. Food sources in winter tend to be much more concentrated around these larders of food like a bird feeder. So most likely what will happen is you'll get a lot of the common birds, a lot of the same birds coming in over and over again, like chickadees and juncos and kinglets and crows probably. But you can also experiment with different types of foods. You can experiment with different types of nuts or seeds. You can experiment with putting different types of fruit out, and the types of food that you experiment with at your bird feeder can draw in different birds, and you can get to know that. The important thing to remember with a bird feeder is that if you do start feeding birds during winter, you have to be consistent with it because the birds will start to rely on you. And in wintertime, if their food source suddenly disappears, if you suddenly stop feeding them for 2 or 3 weeks, in spring and summer it's not that big of a deal, but in wintertime they are depending on you for that food source. So just keep in mind the ethics of this, that there's always an ethics around feeding birds, and if you do decide to feed birds in the winter, you need to be consistent through the winter, especially in those really cold, frozen, snow-covered times when the birds really don't have any other options. If you live in a place where you don't have access to a window overlooking a place where you can put a bird feeder, like maybe you're in an apartment or you just are not able to set up a bird feeder outside your window, you can also set up a feeding station somewhere out in the woods, in a park somewhere. Either set up a bird feeder, or you can even just take along seed that you can throw down right on the ground for the birds. And if you consistently do it in that same spot, then the birds will get used to coming back, and that can be your place to go and watch birds. The third tip is to practice watching birds for longer periods of time. A lot of what you'll be doing with bird watching in winter is not so much IDing new species and seeing lots of different species. It's going to be more about taking the species that you already know and studying them more carefully, actually looking at their behavior more closely. Winter is the perfect time to do this because the food sources are so concentrated in one place. Birds will often spend a lot of time in one spot. At the bird feeder, for example, where you can really watch them and get to see the nuances of their behavior. Even just watching how different birds forage, the actual rhythm of how they move along the ground and they pick seeds up, and every different species of bird, and even individuals sometimes within the same species, have their own little unique ways they go about foraging and getting the food that they need. Some birds will sort of pick a spot on the feeder and they'll just pick seeds out and they'll stay there for a long period of time. Other birds, like chickadees, will fly in, they'll grab a seed, and then they'll fly out, they'll eat it, and another chickadee will come in. You can learn a huge amount about birds just from watching how birds feed. And this is something that you really get to see in wintertime when their food sources are all very concentrated in particular areas. What I would say is to spend some of your time watching birds with binoculars, where you can really get to see them very close, and just pick one bird and watch it for as long as you can with your binoculars. And you'll get to see how it moves, how it feeds, how it behaves at that really close-up level. But then also spend some of your time watching birds without binoculars, because that will help you to see the bigger picture, that there's an overall pattern to how different birds move, and the way that a chickadee moves at a bird feeder is very different from how a sparrow moves and behaves around a bird feeder. And these are things that you can see even without binoculars, and it can get to the point where you can actually identify birds by their overall movement pattern, where you don't even have to see the field markings or any of the usual identification clues that people rely on. You can really just kind of tell by the way that the bird flies into the bird feeder. And that's a really cool thing to know about birds. The fourth tip is that if you do want to find a variety of different species in winter, the best thing to do is to check a variety of locations. So, a bird feeder with a particular type of seed will attract a certain type of species, and it'll attract them consistently. If you can then go to a completely different kind of habitat, that will give you the opportunity to potentially find a completely different community of birds. So going to places like the edges of rivers or water, if you do have open water anywhere in your landscape during winter, going to those places, you might be able to find different types of birds. Going to wetlands can sometimes find you different types of species. If you live in a place that is close to the ocean, I for a long time thought that the robins in my area all went south for the winter, but then I was out birdwatching one day at the ocean and there were a whole bunch of robins hanging out at the ocean in the middle of winter. It's really interesting to see how sometimes the birds that we think are migratory are actually just moving to a different ecology during winter, and they might not actually be going as far as you think they are. So check a variety of locations if you want to have the best chance of finding different species. And the last tip that I'll mention for winter is to use the warm and periods of sunshine to your advantage. What you'll find is that if you go through a long period where, you get maybe a few days of cloud and you get a snowstorm and gloomy kind of weather or very cold weather, that will have a sort of suppressant effect on the bird activity. We had a day like this recently where it had been cloudy for like 5 days, and then right at 3 in the afternoon, the sun came out, and all the birds were filled with energy, and the landscape just felt a lot warmer, and there were so many different birds that got active during that 1.5 hour window before sunset. So it makes sense to pay attention to the weather forecasts and notice for those days where the trend is breaking the cold and the dark and getting into either a day that's a little bit warmer than usual or a day that gives you a sunny break in the middle of a lot of darkness and cloud. So if you follow these tips, you will be really set up this winter to not only see more birds, but to actually feel like you're getting to know them a lot more deeply. Even if you only have a few birds like chickadees and crows and juncos and jays, winter can still be an incredibly rewarding time of year to go bird watching if you approach it from this mindset of getting to know the birds much more deeply and really watching them to see that there's more to a bird than just knowing its name. There's all kinds of fascinating interactions happening with birds out at your bird feeder, out in the forests, out in the wetlands. And if you approach them with this mindset of spending more time watching them, it really becomes a much more rewarding experience and can solidify your understanding of the most common birds during winter, so that when spring comes around and the migrants start returning, you already have that strong foundation on which to learn about other birds. So I hope you found this helpful. I hope you have a lot of fun out there. I would love to know what birds you're seeing out at your feeder, in your yard, out in the forest, wherever it is that you go to watch birds in winter. Let me know what questions you have. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.